Hey, y'all, welcome back. This is going to be chapter 13. So, this is The Voices of the People by Jeffrey Haynes. We're going to jump right into section 2, Change in a Globalized World. Here, I just wanted to mention that, crises are often what lead to greater political demand, revolutions, civil crisis, civil war, etc. So, historically, these have been things like starvation and drought, war, obviously, or civil war, recession and depression, and then things like unequal rights. Um, we have the French Revolution, which was about sort of repression and starvation by the first and second estates, which were the aristocracy and the church, versus the third estate, which were the people, the yeomen. The U.S. Revolution, of course, was unequal rights and frustrations with taxation without representation, a lack of, I don't want to say First Amendment rights, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, etc. But the First Amendment wasn't around back then. We have the Civil War, which was about not only states' rights, but human rights and the rights of enslaved people. The Great Depression caused a whole lot of political turmoil. Led to the rise of sort of the Democratic Party or liberalism for the next, I don't know, generation or two. You've got 2008 and the Tea Party, which sort of led to the Tea Party on the right and the 99% or the Occupy movement, whatever you want to call it, on the left. You've got the Arab Spring. There are many, many, many examples. Um, the chapter at one point claims that the end of the Cold War is what sort of ushered in globalization. But I have a little disagreement here, and I actually argue that it started before that. Yes, the end of the Cold War sort of exponentiated the problem or the change or whatever it might be. But, there's evidence that we were seeing the rise of sort of neoliberalism under Thatcher and Reagan during the 1980s. We had the rise of stock markets and rising inequality across the planet. You had personal computing sort of coming onto the scene for the first time during the 1980s. And then I would even, as an example, point to China, which neoliberalized their economy in 1979 when Mao died and his predecessor, Deng Xiaoping, met with Jimmy Carter, right? So, yes, Nixon in the early 70s met with Mao Zedong, but Mao Zedong was staunchly, philosophically, agrarian communist, right? He was not going to make changes. But once he finally passed and Deng Xiaoping took over, who had been sort of his strategist beforehand, Deng Xiaoping initiated all of these sort of liberalizing policies, especially economically. So, the claim that the Cold War ushered in globalization, I think, is a bit late to the scene, honestly. Okay, the next section is about the color and the umbrella revolutions. So the color revolutions were revolutions that occurred that overturned a lot of sort of dictatorial states in the former Soviet sphere, right? So Serbia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine, etc. Um, this gave a little bit of hope to Fukuyama's, claim of the end of history. Fukuyama claimed that since the Cold War had ended, we're going to move toward this sort of global neoliberal capitalist economy across the planet, and we're going to see democracies take over the planet. So, yes, this gave Fukuyama a little bit of hope, but it hasn't gone all that well since, right? A lot of these states have slipped back into sort of authoritarian competitiveness, dictatorship. We're seeing democracies actually take a downturn as a percentage of this number of states on the planet, right? So, democracy is in a backward slide, which is directly antithetical to Fukuyama's theories. Um, I would also say that some of this stuff was good, perhaps like the umbrella and the color revolutions, but a lot of bad came from it too, right? Not only do we have slippage, which I just talked about, but authoritarians started to sort of perk up a little bit and learn some lessons about what causes these political upheavals. And we have shifted from the idea of these sort of outright dictatorial states, under the auspices of, say, Hitler or Stalin, right, to what we now call sort of semi-democracy or anocracy or competitive authoritarianism, right? So the idea here is that, instead of just being an outright dictator, you offer a facade of democracy, right? So think about like Maduro's Venezuela or Hugo Chavez's Venezuela or Putin's Russia today, right? Yes, they hold elections, but the elections are probably rigged. And even if they aren't, there's censorship of media. There is the jailing or silencing or disappearing or harassing of opposition members. There is the rewriting of political rules to favor the majority party. And so, some really clear examples of this would be Russia, Hungary, Turkey under Erdogan, Egypt. It's semi is mostly dictatorial. Venezuela, which I just mentioned, El Salvador, and much of the Central Corridor, other than say Costa Rica. Um, and then the two most famous scientists who are propounding this theory right now, Stephen Levitsky and Lucas Way from Harvard University, are actually saying this is the direction that the United States is headed in under Donald Trump. So, some of the what I just explained above, some of the reasons that we call it authoritarian competitiveness or competitive authoritarianism, rigged elections, censorship of media, which we're seeing more and more of, hassling opposition members with the legal system, right? Like the Justice Department. Um, Rewriting the political rules to favor the ruling party. So we're seeing that with the new gerrymandering push in Missouri and Texas and elsewhere. And so some of these things are really touching, setting off alarm bells for those who are concerned about American democracy. So that's again one of the questions in the chapter or for this section. And then they also named the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong, but this didn't age well either, right? Since the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong, we have seen China really tamp down on Hong Kong's political freedoms, media freedoms, free speech, things of this sort, right? And then they touched on sort of the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring. I think we're going to, pass over the Arab Spring. We've discussed it many times. But I think it's, it might be important to talk about the Occupy movement and post 2008. Um, what we saw was the subprime mortgage crisis. They were packaging all of these mortgages together. And then the bond rating agencies like Standard and Poor's or Moody's didn't do their due diligence, was calling them AAA plus. So they looked safe, quote unquote. And banks and insurance companies were just snatching these up left and right. But they, we weren't actually testing the assets of those holding these mortgages, right? And so as people stopped paying their mortgages and foreclosures kicked in, uh, we saw massive political movement. What happened was the US government and most of the European governments basically bailed out the banks and in the insurance companies and left the mortgage holders holding the bag. And they lost their homes, they were foreclosed upon. The banks not only got the bailouts, but then got to seize those assets and resell them. And so there was a lot of pissed off Americans on both sides of the spectrum. I mentioned the 99% or the Occupy movement that was on the left, with the Guy Fawkes masks and all this sort of stuff. And then on the right, you had the Tea Party. And, since then, both movements have sort of been co opted, as happens. But this was a big movement in the United States political system. And it wasn't only the US, right? We saw this, at least contributed to the Brexit movement. Um, we saw riots in Greece and Portugal. We saw austerity measures being sort of pushed across the world while social safety nets were cut out from under people to pay these banks and insurance companies. And so it was a big mess and it causes a lot of anger. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll get the next one up soon.